I'm very excited about this because I am weirdly crazy about typography, and we'll have a question and answer session towards the end of it. So if you guys have any questions, just keep noting them down and I'll answer them in the end. Okay, so hi guys, I'm Ada. I am a UX designer at Red Alchemy, and I'm doing this workshop as part of the Red Alchemy Digital Academy, and hopefully you guys will learn something today. And yeah, so typography and its role in branding. So what is typography exactly? Typography is two things. First of all, it's the way that text appears, and secondly, it's the actual act of working with text. Typography plays a huge role in branding. It's one of the key elements. Obviously, everybody wants to communicate some message or the other through their brand, and one of the key ways of doing that is through text. And so the fonts that you use to put your text in and the way you lay all your text out is typography, and it plays a huge role in branding. Typography helps set the mood, it helps clarify the message that you're trying to send, and it helps connect with the reader. This is a classic example. Basically, suppose you're talking to, say, children from the age of 5 to 12. You would go with a font which is slightly more playful, has rounder edges. But if you're talking to somebody who is more our age group, you would pick a more serious font. If you're talking to businesses, you would choose a more serious font, and if you're talking to, let's say, have a very casual sort of message to send, you might go with a slightly more casual looking font. So yeah, how many of you guys remember the 4 lines that your notebooks used to have in kindergarten when you guys learned how to write? Right, everybody remembers those. So basically, you guys actually do know what the anatomy of typography is. You just left it in kindergarten. So all type lies on a baseline. That's the base of your typography, and then the mass of your font is called the X height. The capitals go slightly higher than the mass of the font, so that's called your cap height. And letters like Y, P have a descender, so it will go down to the descender line. And letters like H and T have a ascender, so it will go up to the ascender line. It's very important for us to know this because when we're selecting our fonts, these are the things that we will take into account when we're selecting our fonts. So what type of fonts do we have? You can broadly categorize fonts into 3 or 4 categories. The first is a serif font. Serif fonts are fonts which have tiny strokes at the end of the main part of the letter. So you'll notice those tiny little strokes that are coming on the S, on the bottom of the F, on the R. These strokes are called serifs, and fonts that have these are called serif fonts. These fonts generally tend to look a little more classical, they tend to look a little more traditional and formal, so you might want to take that into account if you're setting type for a slightly more formal or a slightly more traditional sort of message. The next type of font is sans serif. Sans is French for without, so these don't have the serifs that you would see. Because they don't have those strokes, these fonts tend to look a lot more cleaner and have a little more modern look to it. These fonts are great for web publications, so in a digital setting, although you do use serif fonts in a digital setting as well, but sans serif are generally easier to read on a tablet or on your mobile phones. The next type you can broadly categorize into display fonts. These are fonts which are more stylistic in nature, and you wouldn't usually put a big mass of text in these fonts. Some of these are script, some of them are old style, some of them are plain fancy, and we usually limit the use of these sort of fonts in titles and headers because reading really long text in this sort of font becomes very uncomfortable to read. These are some examples of script fonts and old style and fancy fonts. So script is a more elegant sort of look, so you might want to use it in, say, use it in like a wedding invitation or slightly more funeral invitation, I guess. Then there's the the black letter, which is more traditional, has a more like a Bible feel to it. So you would want to use those sort of fonts for something a little more masculine, like a beer, for example. Corona is set in a font similar to this, or Oktoberfest, which again is a beer fest. So it basically gives a nod towards a slightly more traditional sort of look and feel. And then there are your display fancy fonts, which can, again, the mood depends on the kind of message that you're trying to send. So over here you'll see that it's an illustration for a children's book where they're talking about dragons. You notice that the R has a dragon's tail in it. You can get really playful with this, but again, you can't use this in a big amount of text. Type styles. So these are probably the most common things that you guys would be used to when talking about fonts. Everybody knows what bold and italics is. But there's also light and medium and black, which are sort of the in-betweens, the regular and the bold. And there's also italic, has like a whole bunch of styles to that. There's also a condensed version of a font sometimes, and there's an extended version of the font. These condensed and extended versions of fonts play with the width of the font. So if you want a font to take up lesser space and not be so wide, you'd go with a condensed font. But if you want it to be wide and take up a lot of space, then you would go with an extended font. Some typefaces which have all these sort of type styles are called super families. If you were able to find some of those and incorporate that in your branding, you will have plenty of styles to work with within one font. So those are good sort of typefaces to go with. So let's get, now that we've covered what basic type of fonts that there are, let's kind of get into how do you go about selecting a font for your brand. One of the key things that you need to remember is that fonts also convey a meaning. So you want to make sure that the meaning that your fonts convey are in tandem with the meaning of your brand. You want, obviously, this is a classic example. If you write funeral in a funny font like that, people will think you're joking. So for a serious event like a funeral, you want to go with a serious font, but like for a fun event like a circus, you want to go with a slightly more fun looking font. If you put circus in that serious looking font, nobody's going to come and attend the circus. So when you're selecting your fonts, remember that less is more. The fewer fonts that you select, is actually better for you. Try and stick to anywhere between 2 to 3 fonts. Generally, 2 to 3 fonts usually works well. If you can stick to just one font, then that'll be great. The way that you can achieve that is to choose a font which has plenty of styles, like we discussed earlier. When you want to add some sort of contrast to those fonts that you've selected, you might think that, okay, I've only picked 2 fonts, so that kind of limits me. No, that's not the case. You can always kind of get a little more playful with the size of the font, with the weight of the font, with the style that you put the font in. So here's an example. We've put in a heading and a little bit of text where we have 2 fonts selected, Droid Serif and Lato. If I want to put ingredients into, want to highlight the word ingredients a little more, how would you guys do it? Can you suggest? Yeah, I would make it bold, and I could make it slightly bigger, and I could make it italics. Those are some of the tiny things that you can do without introducing a new font in order to create a certain amount of hierarchy and create a certain amount of change in the layout of your text. So when you're selecting your fonts, remember that opposites attract. You want to choose fonts that are different from each other, but at the same time complementary to each other. So you might want to choose a short and wide font and pair it with something which is tall and skinny. You might want to choose a sans serif font and pair it with something which is serif. You might want to choose a masculine looking font and pair it with something feminine. Or you could choose a very clean looking font and pair it with something fun and bouncy. These are some examples that are listed over here. Okay, and then there are fonts that you should definitely stay away from. Why? Because these fonts have come with a certain amount of baggage. They are slightly outdated. They have been overused. There's nothing particularly wrong with the design of these fonts. they just have been used so many times and now come with a certain sort of meaning behind them that it's going to detract from the message that you put. For example, impact is a font which is used across the internet in memes. So if you want your brand to come across as a joke, then impact is the font to go with, but I would not suggest it. Okay, so let's say you guys have picked your fonts and you've picked 2 or 3 fonts that you are comfortable with, you think it goes with the meaning of your brand, it conveys the kind of values that your brand has. So how do you go about using these fonts in the designs that you put together? So the first thing that you want to keep in mind is the hierarchy. Hierarchy is all about guiding the reader through your content. There are 3 things that you want to keep in mind when you're trying to establish hierarchy in your content. A, what is the most key information that you want to portray? What order do you want people to read your content in? And how can you make it easier for the reader to read it? So how can your legibility and readability be good? Remember that whatever content or how well written your content might be, nobody is going to thoroughly read it. It's in this digital age, even you guys probably don't read text thoroughly, you just scan through it. So it's your duty when you're trying to put text together and lay it out, that you make it easy for the reader to scan through your entire text. So I'm just going to give an example over here. This is the design of a business card. Right now everything is set in the same type size and in the same font. If I want to identify the key information in this, it would be the name and the designation of the person. So what would you guys suggest? How do you establish hierarchy? What was the first thing that you would do here?
Name.
Yeah, what about the name? How would you establish the hierarchy?
Bold and bigger.
Yeah, so I would make it bigger, I would make it bolder, and what else can we do? It's very easy to get carried away as well when you're trying to establish hierarchy. Something like this is just too much to do. Like, you don't want to go crazy with your fonts and you don't want to make so many changes that you go overboard. You need to remember to keep it simple. So what we've done here is just increase the size, made it bolder, and changed the color a little bit, but it's still the same font.
Also capitalize the.
And yeah, we've capitalized the web designer. So again, just to recap, there's 5 things that you need to take into account when you're establishing a hierarchy. You want to create a certain amount of contrast. You can play with the color, you can play with the size of the fonts, you can play with the weight of the font, and you can play with the layout as to which information do you want read in which order. But remember to keep it simple, you don't want to go overboard and overdo it. White space. So you know what personal space is. We all have like a certain amount of personal space which we do not like when people get too close to us. It's the similar with any design element, but specifically type. You want to give white space around it. Now white space doesn't necessarily mean that the space needs to be white. It just needs to be empty space around the text. So, and you want to stay away from the edges of your layout. Why? Because in a digital age where everything is responsive, the way things will look on your desktop is not the way it will look on your tablet, and it's not the way it will look on your mobile phone. A classic example of this is a Facebook cover. When we design Facebook covers at Red Alchemy, we're trying to constrain all the text in the middle part of the cover, because we know that when that same cover is seen on a desktop, it's wider, but when we see it on a mobile, the edges get cut off. So you want to stay away from the edges. Here's an example where there are a bunch of elements. So white space is not only between, there has to be white space between the various elements that you've laid out. There needs to be white space between the lines of your text, and there needs to be white space around the whole space as well. So you want to stick with your margins, you don't want to get too close to the edge. The next thing is to keep in mind is alignment. Now you'd be surprised how many times people go wrong with this. They don't follow a grid, things are not aligned to each other, and this is something that gets easily overlooked, but you should really pay a lot of attention to this. So what are the different types of alignments out there? The first is basically centered text. Centered text is where both the edges of your paragraph are soft and everything is lined to the center. This is a very formal looking formal way of setting your text, and it's not I wouldn't recommend it for large body text. I would recommend it for smaller amounts of text, like a wedding invitation, for example, where there's not a whole lot to go through. Also keep in mind that when you're breaking lines in your centered text, you want to break where it makes sense to break. When you're reading text in a centered layout, the point where it breaks is your mind also pauses at that point. So you don't want your text, you don't want to break at a point where it doesn't make sense for the brain to pause in that entire sentence. So keep that in mind, and also you don't want your text to look like a rounded barrel. That kind of looks weird. So you want to make sure that there are plenty of long and short lines in your text so that there's a lot of variety and it doesn't sort of start looking like a fat ball. The next is justified. Traditionally you would see justified in sort of text in magazines or in newspapers and books. It's a very efficient way of laying out text. Both the edges are edges on either side are even. There is no sort of rag on one side, and this is the kind of text that you would see a lot of hyphenation in. When I would in general avoid using justified in the digital age, because it kind of starts looking weird and doesn't read very comfortably. Also, when your point size is too high and your width of your column is too low, then it starts making these weird gaps between the words. You must have noticed this happen a lot in newspapers and magazines, so imagine how much more weirder that would be in a digital space. Left align is the most common way of laying out your text. It's the default on Word. It's the most natural way of reading text. So if you're ever in doubt as to how to lay out your text, go with left aligned. It's the safest bet there is. What you want to avoid when you're laying out text in a left aligned are excessive hyphenations. So you want to avoid that, and orphans and widows. Orphans is when in a paragraph you have one word left at the end of the paragraph in a line of its own. So that word is all alone over there, it's an orphan. You don't want that to happen in your text either. And a widow is when only one line or one word of a paragraph goes into the next column. That also looks odd, it looks weird, it's not very comfortable to read, so you want to avoid that as well. Right aligned. This is the most unusual sort of alignment. It's a welcome change in some cases, but do not put big pieces of text in right aligned. It is uncomfortable to read. The best places to use right aligned text would be in headings, would be in captions. Menus are a good place to use it. A great example of using right aligned text is magazines, where they put all the text on the right, aligned it to the edge of the page. It's an efficient use of space. Okay, so now the next thing that we want to take care of or keep in mind when we're laying out all our text and content on a page is legibility and readability. They're two different things. Legibility is whether you can see the text or not, and readability is how comfortably can you read the text that has been put out. These are some of the things that we keep in use in order to make sure that our text is legible and readable. The first thing that you want to keep in mind is the X height of your entire font. The mass of your font needs to be high enough to read from a certain distance. In this example, both the fonts are in the same type, same point size, except the one on the left. The one on the left is a smaller X height, has a larger descender and a larger ascender. The one on the right has a larger X height but a smaller descender and a smaller ascender. As you can see, this one is easier to read than the one with the smaller X height. The next thing you want to keep in mind is the width of your font. So you remember I told you that fonts can be condensed and extended. So The one on the left is a condensed font, and the one on the right is a more like an average width of a font. So you might, when you're selecting your fonts and when you're laying them out, you want to keep that in mind as well, that you overall should have like a good average width of your font. If it's too squeezed together, it will be uncomfortable to read, and if it's too wide, then it will be uncomfortable to read. Next is the weight of the font. Regular, bold, black. I've explained this to you earlier. One thing that you really want to keep in mind when you're setting the weight of your font is the audience that you're speaking to. If you're speaking to really old people or really young kids, then you don't want to put a font in a really light font because people have a tough time reading it. And you don't want to put in general, you don't want to put it in a very wide width, in a very heavy font either, because if you want to then emphasize on one of your words by making it bold, then how are you going to do that? So keep in mind the weight of your font. Overall, you don't want your entire text to look very heavy, or you don't want it to look very light either. You want to find that sort of balance between the two. And then it's the font size. How small or how large you put your font also makes a huge difference. Generally, we would like to put a body text font in anywhere between 16 to 18 on a digital screen. 16 to 18 pixels is a good size to go with, and for the heading, you just double that. That's a good thumb rule to go with. So if you're putting your body text in 16 pixels, then you would put your heading in 32 pixels, and that would generally work well for you. Next, you want to keep in mind is the spacing. Now spacing, there are three types of spacing: spacing between your letters, spacing between your words, and spacing between the lines. You want to keep all three of these in mind. You don't want your letters to be too far apart from each other, otherwise every word will take up way too much space and it won't be easy to read. You don't want too much space between each one of your words, because again, that will sort of, in your mind, there will be a pause between each word, which is also weird. And you don't want your line spacing to be too little, because otherwise everything will just get squished together, and we don't want that either. So in this example, you will notice that this the one on the left has a smaller line spacing than the one on the right, and it is more comfortable to read the one on the right, especially in a digital format. Make sure a lot of the fonts, the default might not do. You will have to go in and increase the line spacing a little bit. Lastly, you want to keep in mind the colors that you put your font in and the background color that you're putting your text in. You don't want to put them in colors which are too close to each other, in such that you can't even read them. If you see the one on the left, you might feel like it's vibrating a little bit. That's because the colors are clashing with each other. So this is pretty self-explanatory. If you're looking at text which is in a colored text which is put on a colored background and you're not being able to read it comfortably, change it. Okay, so lastly, no matter what fonts you end up choosing for your brand and how you plan on using them, the key is consistency. You want to be consistent with the fonts that you've picked. So now remember one thing, you're looking at these fonts on a daily basis, so you might get sick of them. But your target audience is not looking at these fonts on a daily basis. They're looking at it every now and then. So the more consistently you use your fonts, the more trust you will build in your target audience, and the more credible you will come across as. The best way to maintain consistency is to build yourself a small style or brand guide. An example of that is right here. So over here what I've done is I've put both my different types of headings in, and I've mentioned the size, the point size, the color, and the weight of these fonts. And even in this one, you'll notice that one uses just one font, and you'll see the kind of variety I'm getting with just one font. This one uses two fonts, and you'll see the kind of variety you get with two fonts as well. So you want to note this down, keep it somewhere, and reference it on a regular basis whenever you're creating some sort of design, just so you are consistent at all times. Okay, and tools and resources, that's what everybody's here for really. fonts.google.com is the perfect place to go and select your fonts. They're all web fonts. There's an assurity that they will render correctly on everybody's devices. Earlier, what used to happen was that fonts would only render if the person's desktop had that font installed. But with web fonts, since Google is hosting the font, it's assured that all the fonts that you pick from Google will appear correctly on everybody's devices. Then for inspiration, I like to go to type.io. If suppose I've selected one font and I can't figure out, okay, what's the next font that I want to use, what kind of color can I put it in and stuff like that, then I would go to type.io just for a little bit of inspiration. Typenugget.com lets you create your guide. It will allow you to create your heading, your subheading and your body text. So that's a great place to go and experiment and create your actual style guide. And when I'm creating my posts, we usually use Canva. Most of you are familiar with that. So you really need to know very little about typography to make a huge difference. And good typography can make the difference between a normal, ordinary looking brand and an extraordinary